While Donald Trump was trying to convince the Chinese government to help stabilize the crisis in the Middle East, something far more revealing was happening in the shadows. That is precisely what I want to examine today with the attention it deserves, because what is at stake is not simply another diplomatic crisis. What is at stake is the very architecture of the world order that the United States built with such effort throughout the 20th century. If you find this analysis valuable, I invite you to subscribe to this YouTube channel so you never miss any of our broadcasts. Share this video with those who care about the health of our republic, give it a like so it reaches more people, and tell me where you are watching from, because it matters to me that this conversation reaches every corner of the Spanish-speaking world. An informed citizenry is the first requirement of any democracy worthy of that name. Now then, let us return to the central matter. Recent reports indicate that while Trump was managing the crisis in the Middle East, China, behind his back and at that very moment, was making a deal with Iran. It was discussing how to send Iran technology, military components, and possible weapons literally under the table. And what is most delicate for the Trump administration is that the United States this time could not restrain China with speeches, threats, or high-level diplomatic meetings. The instrument of verbal persuasion, which has so frequently substituted for coherent policy in Washington, proved insufficient against the long-term strategic interests of Beijing. What we are talking about is China reportedly sending Iran drones, satellite support, military intelligence, and industrial supply chains capable of sustaining a conflict for years. Look at the size of that contradiction with Washington's official narrative. The central premise of the White House was that the conflict with Iran would hurt China far more because approximately 80% of the Iranian oil exported from Karg Island is directed toward China. In the logic of that strategy, pressuring Iran meant indirectly pressuring China and disrupting its energy supply chain. Do you know what the fundamental problem with that reasoning is? That while some in Washington kept thinking that way, China had spent years preparing for exactly that scenario. The Chinese, with the strategic discipline that characterizes them, had asked themselves in advance, what if the United States ever tries to block the Strait of Hormuz, through which a large portion of the Iranian oil exports bound for our country passes? What would we do? And they methodically began finding ways to strengthen Iran with dual-use technology. That is the difference between a power that plans decades ahead and one that reacts to next week's news cycle. What China did was not limited to sending electronic components, and this is where the matter becomes considerably more dangerous. If Iran manages to further improve its drone production capacity, which had already caused serious problems for the American and Israeli military presence in the region, and if it manages to increase its electronic surveillance capability thanks to Chinese technological support, then any American military presence in the Middle East becomes not only vulnerable but potentially unsustainable in a medium-length conflict. And that, precisely, is what has the Trump administration deeply worried. That is why Trump traveled to the other side of the world. That is why he personally went to knock on China's door, to ask it, or rather, to try to convince it not to do so. But the problem, as I have observed over decades of following American foreign policy, is not only the arms shipments. That alone would be serious enough. The underlying problem is that China today possesses something worth infinitely more than any political speech, a truly gigantic industrial capacity patiently built over decades while Washington looked the other way. Let me explain why that changes the entire strategic equation. Today, the United States remains an enormous military power. No one who reasons seriously would deny that, but when one begins to examine industrial reality with intellectual rigor, something appears that the White House prefers not to discuss openly. For a very long time, Washington allowed its factories to emigrate from American soil while Wall Street filled its pockets. The logic was perfectly understandable from a short-term perspective. Move to a place where labor costs a fraction of what it costs in the United States, and then sell the finished products at prices 100 times higher than the cost of production. It was profitable. It was efficient in terms of the immediate market. And it was, as is now evident, strategically catastrophic. That place turned out to be China, and China deliberately lowered its production costs even further to bait the hook and get the United States to transfer its entire industrial infrastructure there. The result of decades of those decisions is visible today in all its strategic starkness. No one forced American corporations to make those decisions. They did so freely, responding to market incentives. But free markets without a coherent national strategic vision can produce results that compromise long-term security. That is a lesson that classical liberalism, properly understood, does not ignore. To understand how serious this situation is, one need only ask where the components of an iPhone, a Mac, a Tesla, and practically every major American technology brand from Silicon Valley are produced. The answer, of course, is China, and there lies the root of a problem that no electoral slogan has solved or will easily solve. The physical production chains of the United States gradually shifted toward China over decades. And then something truly disconcerting results from that. The United States designs with great sophistication, but lacks the means to manufacture at sufficient scale and speed. China manufactures in prodigious quantities. Yes, it has been given the label that it does not design, that it only manufactures, that it only copies. There may be some truth in that characterization for certain sectors and certain historical periods, but when the world enters a phase of prolonged tensions, an era of regional wars and energy crises, manufacturing begins to weigh far more heavily than many analysts imagined. History teaches us that in long-duration conflicts, whoever can produce more, faster, and more cheaply holds a decisive advantage. And here comes the historical irony that should escape no one. Trump, paradoxically, ended up doing China a favor by accelerating with his own policies the consolidation of those alliances he so loudly claimed to want to dismantle. A modern war cannot be sustained solely on patriotic speeches or press conferences. What you need are missiles, spare parts, chips, sensors, drones, and batteries capable of quickly replacing all equipment destroyed in combat. There, precisely there, is where China became dangerously strong. What does the United States need today? To replenish sensors, radars, missiles, aircraft, and all the military equipment damaged or destroyed. And notice how the global panorama changes when viewed from that perspective. China holds the United States practically in the palm of its hand, not through direct military superiority, but through structural industrial dependence. That is a form of power far more difficult to counter than any aircraft carrier. Previously, the idea was that Washington could economically exhaust any rival through sanctions. But it turned out that the countries targeted by those sanctions began adapting with a resilience that no one in Washington adequately anticipated. Russia strengthened its energy and industrial production as a direct response to external pressures. Iran learned by necessity to manufacture cheap drones in enormous quantities precisely because isolation forced it to develop its own capabilities that it would otherwise never have had. And China, meanwhile, built what I would not hesitate to describe as the most powerful manufacturing base the world has seen since the industrial rise of the United States in the first half of the 20th century. What I'm trying to tell you without mincing words is something that the White House probably did not anticipate, that instead of separating these countries, American pressure ended up uniting them around a common agenda of reducing dependence on Washington. And that has long-range strategic consequences that no tweet or tariff can undo overnight. Here is another element that is absolutely indispensable for understanding this story in its entirety. It has to do with energy. China made a long-term strategic decision several years ago, and today that decision looks extremely intelligent in light of events. What China said, in essence, was, we cannot depend on a single energy source or a single supply route. And they began investing simultaneously in everything: coal, oil, nuclear energy, solar energy, wind energy, large-scale batteries, enormous electrical grids, and energy storage of various forms. All of that in parallel with a planning discipline that Western democracies have demonstrated serious difficulty replicating, not because China is a model of environmental virtue, since it remains one of the planet's greatest polluters, not because it wants to look good at climate conferences. China did it because it understood something elementary. A country that depends excessively on vulnerable maritime routes ends up suffocating at the first moment of serious international crisis. And here is where one sees with complete clarity the difference between China's strategic vision and the short-term political discussion that has dominated Washington for too many years. While China was investing formidable sums in industrial automation and energy storage, part of the discussion in the White House remained trapped in truly superficial ideological squabbles. I am not arguing that oil will cease to be relevant in the next decade. That argument aged very poorly. What this is about is something more sophisticated and more important. The true strategic business of the 21st century is not merely producing energy. It is storing energy. It is whoever manages to store any type of energy, whether gas, oil, or electricity, and distribute it efficiently while reducing strategic vulnerabilities. That is what defines power in the new geopolitical era taking shape before our eyes. And guess who dominates a large part of the world's manufacturing of energy storage components, batteries, and electrical storage systems? China, naturally. When you put all those pieces together, you begin to understand why the Iran-China matter is considerably larger than it appears at first glance. It is not only about oil or only about the Middle East. What is moving is the global balance of power in its deepest and most enduring form. Reports on China's possible support for Iran include a category that deserves special attention: so-called dual-use components. These are sensors, electrical converters, and electronic systems that can officially be sold commercially to manufacture cell phones, but that also end up being fundamental elements for building drones, missiles, and modern surveillance systems. Without those components that China provides, Iran would not be manufacturing its drone swarms, nor would it have access to missile technologies that, incidentally, the Pentagon itself has spent years trying to develop without fully achieving at the speed the moment requires. And here lies the reason why conventional sanctions prove insufficient against this new reality. Sanctioning tanks or aircraft is relatively straightforward, though the United States has not even been fully efficient at that, since things keep reaching Iran by sea, land, and even rail. But when components can enter disguised as ordinary industrial parts, such as batteries, microconductors, semiconductors, and cables, the game changes completely. Iran converts them into weapons in quantities that its adversary can hardly anticipate or counter at the same speed. And while all of that is happening, enormously uncomfortable questions are beginning to emerge within the United States that no political leader seems willing to answer with the honesty the situation demands. How truly prepared is American industry to sustain a prolonged conflict with Iran, especially when Iran will show no signs of exhaustion as long as it has China's continuous backing? What happens if the world enters a stage where global supply chains fracture even further? What happens if China begins restricting critical components? What very few have been willing to say plainly is that the United States no longer holds the unilateral power to sanction the entire world. China, on the other hand, does have that capacity in key dimensions. If China decides not to sell magnets to the United States, it literally paralyzes entire sectors of its economy and defense industry. Trump himself publicly acknowledged that China holds the world monopoly on certain magnets, and that if it stopped exporting them, the United States would find itself in an extremely difficult position. He announced that was why it was necessary to develop a domestic magnet industry. But that plan, like so many others, never got off the ground with the seriousness it required. That gap between rhetoric and concrete action is, in my judgment, one of the most serious and persistent problems of our political life. It is something I have been writing about for decades. The short electoral cycle, dependence on polls, the media spectacle that replaces serious analysis, all of that carries a strategic cost that accumulates silently for years and appears suddenly when one can least afford it. That is not a problem exclusive to one party or one president. It is a structural problem of our democratic politics that requires an equally structural solution. China, by contrast, plans in decades, not in 4-year terms, not in electoral cycles. And there lies, with all its analytical brutality, the fundamental difference between both models. In Washington, everything revolves around elections, polls, headlines, and the next news cycle. In Beijing, they know who they are working with today and who they will be working with in 10 or 20 years. That produces a stability in strategic relationships that many allies and commercial partners around the world are beginning to value with growing seriousness, regardless of their preferences about systems of government. When Trump speaks of recovering America's manufacturing base, of bringing factories back to the country, he understands the political dimension of that message well. It resonates with millions of Americans who have watched their industrial communities crumble over decades. He is right in the diagnosis. But the economic and historical reality is that one cannot rebuild an industrial base of China's magnitude overnight, and certainly not without a coherent, sustained, bipartisan national strategy backed by public and private investment over a minimum period of 15 to 20 years. China spent decades building that position, and while the United States remains internally divided, China continues expanding its infrastructure, its industrial production, its energy technology, and its strategic relationships on every continent. That is why the entire Iran-China matter generates such well-founded concern in the strategic sectors of the United States. The real fear is not simply that China sells a few weapons to Iran. The real fear is that China is building a far deeper cooperation with the rival powers of the United States, with the purpose of sustaining proxy wars that gradually bleed the hegemonic power, erode its credibility, and accelerate the multipolarity that Beijing has been seeking for decades. And the available evidence suggests that this is, in fact, occurring with a systematicity that should alarm anyone who reflects seriously on the future of the international order. If that continues advancing, the international chessboard is going to change much more rapidly than most believe possible. This strategic game is only beginning its most intense and consequential phase, because when the major powers measure their strength in industrial, energetic, and technological terms simultaneously, the consequences are not reduced to deciding who wins a particular battle. What is at stake is the very structure of the international order. It is a struggle for global power and potentially the end of a hegemonic era that defined the world since 1945. I invite you to reflect on all of this with the seriousness the moment demands, not with the sensationalism that dominates too many media spaces, but with the intellectual sobriety that the gravity of the situation requires. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel, share this video with those who care about these matters, give it a like, and above all, tell me where you are watching from. The public conversation our society needs cannot depend solely on the headlines of the day. It depends on citizens willing to think deeply, to demand coherence from their leaders, and to understand that history does not wait for those who prefer the slogan over the analysis.